and posted on the website. Juvenile justice and this juvenile justice and restorative justice webinar is a collaborative presentation of the National Benevolent Association and Reconciliation Ministry. And on behalf of both of these justice ministries, Reconciliation and NBA, we thank you for your support and your participation today. I'm Rebecca Hale with the National Benevolent Association. This is the fourth of a series of 4 webinars that we've been hosting over the past 12 months in an effort to raise awareness of the systemic implications of the school to prison pipeline. And we've also hosted these webinars in partnership with Reconciliation Ministries to share some information and collect some information related to the active resistance that's employed within our church to break the pipeline, as well as restore human dignity to returning citizens impacted by the criminal justice system. We have 2 presenters today, and I'll introduce them in order of their presenting. The first is Reverend Deetra Baker-Wise, who is one of the pastors of Liberation Christian Church in St. Louis, Missouri. Deetra is a community activist and leader of the Clergy Caucus for Missouri Churches United, and an organizing specialist with the National Benevolent Association. We really welcome you, Deetra, to this conversation today. Our other presenter today will be the Reverend Dean Bucalis, who is an attorney by trade. He is also the pastor of Mission Behind Bars, the founding director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, and the NBA director of the Prison and Jail Ministry Affinity Group. And Dean, we welcome you and thank you for your work. Before our first presenter begins, I want to remind you that you can use the chat feature that's in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to share questions out. And we'll be collecting those questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be leaving plenty of time at the end of the presentations for a question and answer period where I'll share out the questions that I've been hearing from you, and Deetra and Dean will have a chance to engage you in the questions that you bring forward. Thanks to everyone for making time this afternoon to join us for this webinar on juvenile justice and restorative justice. And Deetra, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Excited to be with you all today. I guess let's get started. I'm Deetra Baker, and I guess I'll just say a little bit about my background and how I've come to this work. I've been a juvenile chaplain serving in St. Louis for the last 11 years. And so I've been a juvenile chaplain working in the St. Louis metropolitan area in juvenile detention centers and residential treatment facilities, but with all court-involved youth. And so I've been steeped in a way in experiences of the pipeline and kind of what it looks like. So the way I always like to start off is just a quick review of where we'll be going today. I want to give a definition not only of the school to prison pipeline, because it's actually a very complex system, but also how do we break that down? And so what does it mean to break the pipeline? And then I'm going to go through each of the systems that cooperate in the school to prison pipeline. So I will do that. And then finally, we'll have some questions for you. So what is the school to prison pipeline? The school to prison pipeline, let me start off with a story I think that describes it best. I'll take a young man that I call Jared. Jared was 16 years old. He was allegedly charged with having a gun in the community. He wasn't actually at school. He was allegedly found to have a gun. Notification, the school got wind of this alleged gun charge, and Jared was brought into the court. He was being held at detention on this alleged charge. And what was kind of disturbing or heartbreaking, depending on how you look at it, is we're up in court with Jared, and Jared's talking about going back to school and football and being involved in school, and the judge is, Jared, we've never seen Jared before. Jared wasn't a kid that was involved in the system ever before. We had never seen him before. the judge was releasing him that day and sending him as far, back to school. What Jared didn't know, and what I knew, is that downstairs, Jared's superintendent and principal were having a hearing, a disciplinary hearing. And in that hearing, that they, just based on his charge, not that he was convicted or found guilty of the charge, but just because he was charged with having a gun in the community, not even on school property, that was a safe schools violation. And because of zero tolerance policies around that issue, Jared was expelled from school. And I mean, like, can't go back to that school. Will have to be in an alternative education system from that point forward. And so that's the picture of what we're talking about, like what happens to actual kids that are in the pipeline. So these are students that are expelled, they're arrested for sometimes minor, sometimes maybe major offenses. They may not have been convicted of these crimes, but notification to the school commences, and those kids are oftentimes referred to the juvenile justice system. And we know that the stats show that children of color, Black and brown children, are disproportionately targets and affected by the school prison, the pipeline, especially kids who are involved in foster care or kids that have disabilities. And so that's kind of the phenomenon we're talking about, where kids are having some kind of interactions in the community or in the school, and then those interactions are moving kids through the juvenile justice system and then eventually to the criminal justice system. This is just a great picture of, like, who are these kids, what's happening to them. And I think the best part to start, because a lot of times people don't understand about, we talk about mass incarceration a lot, we don't realize that there is a system that's funneling people into kind of this to the new Jim Crow, and those are juveniles. And if you look at the bottom part of this slide, I think it's like um, kind of shocking when you see that 68% of males um, in federal prison did not have their high school diploma. That 70% of inmates in California uh, are former members of the foster care system. And so that means that some major protective factors have been removed, and we know that school is one of them. We know that Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended from school than other children. And we know the Black girls actually are 6 times more likely to be suspended from school. And so this is the picture. This is the beginning to give you a picture of what it looks like for kids to, again, through school, policing, and then juvenile justice, to begin to move to the prison system. So, what does it mean to dismantle the school to prison pipeline? I think for some people that's contextual, but the model that we're working with here in St. Louis, that others have worked on in Georgia and in Connecticut and other places, is that we realize that there are 3 systems at least that are cooperating in the criminalization and incarceration of youth of color, and that if you're going to break the pipeline and dismantle the pipeline, that you actually have to organize in all 3 of these areas. So one is around schools, particularly around school discipline, which we'll talk about more, and then around policing. We know that there's a lot of work actually that needs to be done with juveniles and policing, in terms of organizing and dismantle the pipeline. And then kind of a quiet system that most people don't pay attention to in their community, which is the juvenile courts or the juvenile justice system, and what's happening in those courts in terms of racial bias and racial inequity, in terms of representation, what's happening to kids when we talk about criminal justice. And so we have to organize in all 3 of those systems together collaboratively to be able to begin to dismantle the pipeline. And so we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So here are the feeds. It's just kind of a review of what I was just mentioning about schools and police practices and the juvenile courts, and how those kind of lead to prison. And so now we're going to talk about schools for a few minutes. And I wanted to start that off by showing you a video of what we're talking about. What are we talking about that's happening in the schools, that kind of leads to these interactions where youth are moving from schools into the juvenile justice system.
This morning, this arrest at a South Carolina school is sparking community outrage. The confrontation all caught on tape, showing a police officer approaching an unidentified female student at her desk Monday. Watch as the officer grabs the girl's arm, then wraps his own arm around her neck, slamming her and her desk to the ground.
She was causing disruption in the class. School resource officer asked her repeatedly to leave with him. She refused. At that point, he put her under arrest.
Students witnessed the incident during their algebra class, taking out their cell phones and hitting record.
I was scared, terrified. So that was my first judgment call, is get your phone out so that everything after this is recorded.
Only one student, Nia Kenny, decided to step in, a decision that landed her in jail.
I am traumatized. I could not believe this was going on. They got her out the classroom, and then he came back and he was like, "You want some of this too?" And then he just said, "You going to jail too." And he put me in handcuffs.
Overnight, the police department confirming the man's identity as Ben Fields, a school resource officer who joined the program in 2008, even receiving a Culture of Excellence Award for proving to be an exceptional role model in 2014. The school's website also lists Fields as the football team's defensive line coach and strength and conditioning coach. This morning, police are investigating the incident. Fields has been placed on unpaid administrative leave and banned from school property.
My initial reaction is one of shock. Very disturbed with it, and I have a lot of questions I won't answer.
School district officials call the video extremely disturbing and tell ABC News they are deeply concerned, noting that the district will not tolerate any actions that jeopardize the safety of our students. And this is not the first time the deputy has been under investigation. He's currently facing a lawsuit in federal court accusing him of violating the civil rights of another high school student. Fields was also sued in federal court back in 2007. In that case, a jury ruled in his favor. There's now a request for the FBI to get involved. George and Robin.
People want to know much more.
Yeah, it's hard to explain that one.
It is disturbing to say the very least.
So you guys can get access to that video, and there's actually lots of them online. So when we talk about schools,
Of an arrest at a South Carolina school is sparking community outrage.
hold on 1 second.
The confrontation
Sorry.
all caught.
It's okay. I know that's tricky. But we wanted you guys to kind of see what we're talking about. Just kind of gives a visual. So for example, in New York City, we know that 5,000 safety resource officers were placed in the New York City schools. And so what has happened in a lot of schools, people are like, how are we getting to this place where we're having these interactions between police officers and students? Well, the presence of police officers in schools was the result of a lot of safe school acts in our country. And so I want to just lift up two of them, just so you'll have them for your own reference. One was the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act of 1986, and then the Safe and Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994, which is the one that's listed on your slide. And that was in a culture, Clinton was in office, and there was a climate in our country to kind of get tough on crime, and that precipitated and moved down to the schools, combined with some famous school shootings like Columbine, where there was definitely a concern, understandably, that we wanted our kids to be safe in school. But what happened with that is that then nonviolent kind of offenses became more criminalized and hyper criminalized. And so we have, moving down into the schools, these zero tolerance policies, expelling children for minor offenses, more police officers present in classrooms or on the school campus, which meant that instead of teachers handling issues that they might have normally handled in terms of discipline, now you have officers that are called in to handle discipline issues. And with escalation, officers can make formal charges and then enter kids into the juvenile justice system. And so the data has shown that that's exactly what has happened. And so that's the beginning of what has happened. The third issue that contributes to schools contributing to the school to prison pipeline are standardized test scores. It actually has created an incentive. We know, like for instance, in Florida, they did some examinations and they found out that students were getting suspended more frequently right before standardized testing was done. And so we know that standardized testing sometimes creates a pressure where students that are not performing as well seem to have a correlation with higher suspension rates. And last but not least, we know that one of the other contributing factors is racial bias. We know there's a history of racial inequity in our public school system. There's been study after study that shows that even when you control for a white student did the same behavior a black student does, when you control for those kind of factors, that black students are suspended as much as 6 times higher than white students. And so we know that there are issues around racial bias that have to be addressed in the schools in terms of suspension and discipline. So I'll give you a second to kind of soak that in, and we're going to move on to policing really quickly and give you a chance to kind of begin to write some questions. What are some of your questions about the Safe Schools Act? What are some of your questions around safety resource officers and standardized testing and racial inequity in schools? We were involved in the Ferguson movement here in St. Louis, and one of the things I think people always forget or that they don't talk about a lot is that Michael Brown, one, was a teenager that was stopped on a pedestrian patrol stop. Um, However, what we don't talk about a lot is that when we talk about policing changes that need to be made, we often don't involve juveniles. We don't think about what's going on with kids and the police. What's going on with kids and the police? We don't have a lot of data even now that tracks, pedestrian stops, illegal search and seizures of teenagers. Um, and so it's really important that when we talk about kind of the laws and the changes that are being made around the country around police practices, that we ask, how are those impacting juveniles? Are we keeping data for what's happening between police officers and kids? We know there's issues of racial profiling. We know there's issues around arrests, illegal search and seizures. They're not monitored as closely when it comes to kids. And then the rates in which Black and Latino youth are charged and what they are charged with. We're finding problems and disparities in police practice with those. So we know one of the major things we have to do is really track more closely the data and pay attention to what's going on with juveniles with police practices. Um, Last but not least, and this is the area I actually know the best, this is the area that I live in, is what's going on in juvenile courts. And so when I say juvenile courts, I mean youth that have been charged by the police officer. So kids, when they come into juvenile court, they've been referred from one or two places. They've either come from school, the school referral has brought them in, or a police officer has brought them in. That's 98% of the kids that come into the juvenile detention center. Those are the two sources of where they've come from. And so some of the issues that we are facing in the juvenile courts are, one, disproportionate minority confinement, or DMC. We know that Black and Latino youth or youth of color are held longer and more frequently than white youth. Um, the other problem that we have in the courts, and I'll specifically mention St. Louis Family Court, is that we have issues with legal representation. Um, in Missouri, for instance, in St. Louis County, we have one public defender for over 400 cases in 2014. Uh, so that means that of those 400 cases, there's one public offender, one wonderful lady. She's wonderful, but she has 400 cases to try to litigate. And so she cannot spend the amount of time that is required by national juvenile justice standards that needs to be spent on those cases, because she just doesn't have time to. And so what that means is that there are children that are not getting the rigorous legal representation at every stage in the process that they need. We have children in St. Louis County, for instance, that are in residential treatment facilities, and when they go to court, because of the lack of public defenders, they don't even have representation at some of their continuation hearings. The legal representation is just not available. So we know that these are all issues that we need to address. So again, I give you another break to get a chance to write some questions down, put some thoughts down about how you're processing this. And then I want to talk about, okay, what do we do? What do we do? How do we begin to fix this? So let's go back. We're going to go back to those three areas, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that people are doing all around the country. And so the big things I'm going to highlight, I'm not going to be able to go through everything on here, but I want to highlight two things. So for schools, school discipline policies are essential in disrupting the pipeline. The first thing is define each state and each district is different. There's a lot of leeway on what districts and schools can do. So the first thing is to investigate, especially before you start accusing districts of what they're doing or not doing. Find out what are they doing around discipline, and they are required by law to keep data about their school discipline policy. So you find out the data, find out how are they doing in terms of issues of racial disparity and equity. Find out what their conduct is and how they tracked how teachers administer that. And then there are models out there like the positive behavior intervention supports. There's other programs out there that help teachers and schools adapt a climate that is less punitive and more restorative, which Dean will elaborate on more in a few minutes. And then the other thing is that there does need to be some radical organizing around the Safe School Act violations and zero tolerance policies. They really remove one of the major protective factors that our kids have, which is school. And so it's really important to find out what's going on with zero tolerance policies at your school and how those are affecting kids in the community. Policing. We talk about training for officers. There's a lot of work being done around the country around policing efforts for fair and impartial policing. It's really important that we talk about safety, school resource officers, those officers that are placed in the schools. What about their training? Who's looking at them? Who's evaluating how they're performing, how they're interacting with students? Even how can we support them? How can we help them to have build their rapport? And also some of these behavioral supports so that things are not getting violent, things are not getting escalated, they're not getting into power struggles with students, that they're not bringing students into the juvenile detention centers unless it is absolutely necessary. And so that's really important. So to really get a handle on who are these school resource officers in the community, what are they doing? And then the other thing about in the community are data around communities, community police, and how they are interacting with students and young people in the community. What are they doing in terms of search and patrol and pedestrian stops and seizures? A lot of my kids will tell me, Miss Deidre, the police, they just come in my neighborhood and they harass me. They're patrolling us. They're looking for us. They're looking to see if we're in trouble, even if they don't have a reason. We're just walking around. We're not doing anything. We're just in our neighborhood. They're stopping us. They're asking us questions. And there's some legal ramifications around that. So to begin to find out what's going on between officers and youth in the community. And then finally, around juvenile detention and courts, there's so much work that can be done. But I'll lift up two things. I'll lift up one, a lot of some national work that's happening is raise the age legislation. It's happening in a lot of states. And the idea behind raise the age is that we know that juveniles do not become adults until their mid-20s. That's what the brain research is saying. And so the idea is that we need to encourage juvenile systems to kind of extend their lifespan, how long they'll hold juveniles, so that kids can be in a more treatment-oriented environment versus going into an adult environment, that time would be extended. And so raise the age is one of the legislative pieces that do that. The other thing I would say, is to begin to ask questions about representation in your state. What's going on with your public defender system in the state that you're in? How are juveniles represented? What access do families and youth have to quality and rigorous legal counsel? And are there reentry programs for juveniles in your area? You know, when there's a lot of reentry programs for adults when they come out, ways to guide them and help them and support them when they are released. But what about juveniles? And so ask around, find out if there's any kind of coordinated system of care for reentry for juveniles in your area. And there's other things on here, but I won't go into them now. Just wanted to give you kind of a little menu of some of the things we can do to disrupt the pipeline. So that's the end of my section for today. Dean is going to come to you in a moment. Just want to give you a minute to chat, write some questions down so we can talk at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Deidre. That was really helpful, informative, and it really set, I think, the framework for a lot of work that needs to be done in each of our communities. My background is briefly one that has involved me both in the court system, but also with communities of faith. I've been a licensed lawyer for over 25 years, and some of my work had been in juvenile court. I'm presently serving a congregation inside a women's detention facility. But moreover, I've been very interested and fascinated by the principles of restorative justice over the years, and have been trained as a restorative justice facilitator here in Louisville. And I'm going to share a little bit with you about my experience doing that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what restorative justice really is, because it's one of those approaches that we know can contribute to dismantling the school to prison pipeline. We can't cover all of that this afternoon. It's a huge topic. There's a lot of information about it on the internet. So I'm just going to give a short introduction to the principles of restorative justice and how it relates to the issues that Deidre has highlighted this afternoon. Basically, restorative justice is a holistic and restorative approach to the traditional criminal justice system by bringing together the offender, the victim, and the community to try to make things right, to bring about some healing and to repair the harm that's been done by criminal acts. When put into practice with juveniles, the results of this approach has been rather remarkable. I was first introduced to that through Alan McRae, who is someone who's worked with juveniles at risk in New Zealand for over 25 years. The situation in New Zealand was actually dysfunctional with respect to how they were dealing with juveniles who were committing crimes and getting in trouble there, and particularly the effects that it had on the indigenous Maori population with respect to the disproportionate number of that group who were being incarcerated and detained as juveniles. So Alan McRae teamed with Howard Zehr, who is many would consider him one of the grandfathers of the restorative justice movement, to introduce a practice that included restorative practices in the juvenile system in New Zealand. And so as he did this and received the support of the court system, what they saw was a transformation of the juvenile justice system there. Eventually, the result was the closure of most of the detention facilities for juveniles in New Zealand. And what it brought about was a completely different atmosphere of how young people were interacting, not only with their communities, but with the court system. There's a great book that is about that particular experience that I recommend to you. It's written by Alan McRae and Dr. Howard Zare, and it's called The Little Book of Family Group Conferences, New Zealand Style. I'm going to show you a little bit of that, just in case you want to take a look at that at some particular point in time. We also have some links to resources at the end of this particular PowerPoint. So I'm going to go back one of these slides to begin to talk to you about how it works. How does the restorative justice system really work? It involves basically three parties, all volunteers: the victim, or somebody that has been individually harmed, the offender, the person who was the perpetrator of a crime, and the community. Oftentimes in juvenile situations, with the victim will be somebody in the neighborhood, and they will have agreed to participate in the restorative justice practices in order to bring about some resolution to the circumstance that brought a juvenile into the criminal justice system. The offender, obviously, someone that was of 18 years of age or younger, and oftentimes in the restorative justice conference program, they will bring with them to these conferences either a mentor or a parent or a guardian as a support person. And then the community. The community is involved in a couple of different ways through trained facilitators that basically moderate the conferences, and it can also include police officers, school officials, teachers, other community members who may have a stake or an interest in that particular event. The idea is to try to bring people together so that there can be a conversation that works toward restoration and some reconciliation. The goal is really to find a resolution that diverts the juvenile from a contested court contest. As Deetra mentioned, our juvenile justice system right now is receiving so many referrals from schools that the juveniles are rarely given the needed individual attention that would be required as they enter into the criminal justice system. The result often is punishment and detention, which furthers that pipeline to the prison. So if we can find ways in which we can divert these young people into a system that treats them more individualistically as well as more kindly, I think we're going to find that the results, as we already have discovered, will be much different. So what the practices and programs of restorative justice initially do is they identify and they try to take steps to repair the harm that was done. They try to involve all the stakeholders, which would be the victim as well as the offender and the community. And they move toward transforming the traditional relationships between communities and governments into one that responds to crime. So it brings people together with opportunities for conversation, for questions, for repentance, for forgiveness. And the result of this is transformative for all the parties that are involved. There are three principles of restorative justice that I want to highlight. One is that justice requires that we work to restore those who've been injured. So many times in our criminal justice system, victims just never have an opportunity to participate. In cases in juvenile courts, because the cases are often plea bargained, the cases move quickly, the victims never even step foot into the courtroom. They never have an opportunity to ask questions. They never have an opportunity to confront the offender. They never have an opportunity to have their questions answered. And we realize that in order to begin repairing the harm, that those who have been victimized need to have a voice in this process. the second principle is that 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 those directly involved in the crime have an opportunity to participate um, if they wish to do that. Once again, this is a voluntary program, but by bringing the community in and having community volunteers participate, new lenses are looked through to look at possible solutions and resolutions, and people who have a stake in making their community and having their community become a safe place also have an opportunity to give voice in this process. And third, we know that the government's role is to preserve a just public order. Uh, that's a given, but the community's role is to build and maintain a just peace. I think when we invite the community to become a part of the solution uh, and become a stakeholder in this, the results of that are much more positive and proactive and progressive. The restorative justice programs are characterized basically by four key values. Um, One is encounter, um, and that's one in which we try to create opportunities for victims, offenders, and community members who want to participate to discuss the crime and its aftermath. It's just a way of getting people together to have that conversation, to be in dialogue with one another. And it's not just a conversation, but it's a conversation that looks toward um, taking steps to repair the harm that's been caused by the actions, in this case, by a juvenile. And so there's an expectation that we're going to come to a place where there is some movement toward repairing the harm that was caused and amends are made. Third, there's a reintegration, that there's a desire to restore victims and offenders to whole contributing members of society. For victims, it offers an opportunity for closure so that they can move beyond this particular situation that caused them stress and distress. And for the juveniles, it gives them an opportunity to participate in some type of resolution where they can contribute to repairing that harm and moving forward in their lives without the stigma of having a criminal conviction on their records. And the fourth part of this is inclusion. By bringing other parties into the conversation to participate in the resolution that derives from this particular criminal event, uh, it 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 creates an atmosphere and situation where everyone is working together so that it's no longer this adversarial process, but it's a process in which people are working hand in hand to not only come with this up with a solution, but also to nurture, support, and hold the juveniles accountable for their activities. There are a lot of different types of programs that are affiliated with the restorative justice movement. There's a victor offender mediation, circles of accountability, ex-offender assistance, restitution, community service, and I commend you to explore some of those. Prison Fellowship has an excellent website that has a lot of materials with respect to restorative justice. Um, if you look at the resources from East Mennonite University, which is the place that houses the Restorative Justice Center that was created by Dr. Howard Zare, all of those resources will help better inform you about how these practices and programs work. The one that I want to talk briefly about in closing is family group conferences, which has been adopted by Restorative Justice Louisville. This is a program that started as a pilot program here in Louisville to work with juveniles. And one of the reasons that it began was in response to one of the problems that Deidre had illustrated, and that was that the court system here in the county attorney's office was being inundated by cases that were being referred by the schools because Jefferson County schools had a zero tolerance policy for so many years that anytime there was any disturbance in the school, anytime there was a fight, a disagreement, anytime a juvenile was suspected of any possible type of crime, they were referred to the court system, and the court system's case log just kept growing and growing and growing. So there were a number of people that got together in the community, the legal community, the peacemaking community, the religious community, and we got together and began exploring possible solutions to this, and came up with a program based on the model from New Zealand, actually, family group conferences, and implemented that in the Louisville area. And so since that time, a number of volunteers have been trained as facilitators, and cases are now being regularly referred to Restorative Justice Louisville as juveniles are being deferred from the criminal justice system. And the way that it works is that we interview the victim, we interview the offender, both of whom are volunteers. We make sure they understand the purpose of the program, what a conference will look like, and what that will entail. We meet with each one of those folks separately to explain those things, and then we gather people together. We usually have two facilitators, and we invite other stakeholders. So sometimes the juvenile will bring a family member. Oftentimes the victim might bring a support person. Sometimes we'll have a school official. Sometimes there'll be a police officer. And we sit around, and everyone has an opportunity to talk. And we move toward a resolution that holds the juvenile accountable. There are covenants that are signed, and then that's monitored. And the results have been remarkable. We've been able to keep many, many juveniles from moving forward into that prison pipeline, and we continue to grow that particular program. So I want to encourage folks to go on the Restorative Justice Louisville website, find out a little bit more about how things are being done here. There's lots of similar programs in places across the country. There are a lot of innovative ways in which people can approach this particular problem. But this is an area that we think our churches can not only support, but we can also be a resource for volunteers in order to address this growing and grave problem, and our churches can then become part of the solution. I'm going to stop there. I hope that you all have put together some questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca as she moderates that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dean and Deetra, for a lot of information. And one of the things that I was listening for was, what could I start tomorrow in my own congregation in terms of organizing and engagement in this work? And I really feel like there were some good hints along the way for that. So thank you for that. We've collected a lot of questions, and I'm going to start through, and we'll go through as many of them as we can. First, one of the questions we got was, is this slideshow available? Can we make it available? And so this will be available to participants in two ways. We'll email the slideshow out to everybody who's registered, and in about a week, the slideshow and the recorded webinar will be on the NBA webpage at nbacares.org. So you will have access to this. You can also find Dean and Deetra's email on the NBA webpage. So if there are ongoing questions that come up, or you think about ways you might want to be engaged, feel free to be in touch with them moving forward, or any of us. So one of the questions that we got, Deetra, and we'll talk about we'll just start with the first question. Deetra, is the school to prison pipeline something that's widely considered a fact? Or is this a concept that's still being debated? You're on mute, Deetra.
I was still muted. That's a good question. But I guess how I would answer it is, I would say that there's plenty of data out there in each one of those areas, particularly around the school discipline. So around the school circle, there's just overwhelming data around the school circle that zero tolerance policies just have not been helpful, that they've actually hurt really all students, but disproportionately students of color. And then the other two, I think we're kind of all aware of what's going around policing. I just don't think it's been a conversation that much with juveniles. There's just like a gap in that data and that conversation around what's going on with juveniles and policing, which I actually think is a really important part of the Ferguson piece that gets missed. And then around juvenile courts, I would say it's a state thing. Like, Illinois is a little bit better than Missouri is around these issues and how they've organized. States organize their juvenile justice courts differently than others. Like, we have a very strange organization that's very, very rare in Missouri that a lot of other states don't have. So, I would definitely say around school discipline, I think the case is very clear. Policing, it's a conversation that hasn't been really had yet. And so there's not as much data to support it. And then if we go to the juvenile side, I would say you really got to do some digging in your state to kind of figure out what's going on in your state.
I think there are two things that I'd like to add real briefly to that, teacher. One is I know that there are a lot of jurisdictions now that are revisiting the juvenile justice system that's in place because it has become such an adversarial system, which was never really designed to be. It was really designed to be driven by what's in the best interest of a child. But because of some of these other policies that have come down, we've moved to a much more adversarial system. So by seeing our legislatures reviewing our juvenile justice court system, we can conclude by that they know, we all know, that it's a broken system right now. And the second component of that has to do with what happened in the Louisville community. There was a disproportionate number of children of color who were being referred to the court system and then being confined afterwards. And when that was paired with the number of school referrals that were coming because of the zero tolerance policy, it became very apparent to everybody that that was the key issue that we needed to address. So I think there's a recognition now that if you put the pieces together, there is this school to prison pipeline, and it affects people of color in a disproportionate way.
Thanks. And this is sort of a follow-up question to that, really, that we got. Dean, when you were talking about the restorative justice program that you've been able to initiate with partners in the Louisville area, are the courts and the policing system, have they been open to those restorative justice programs and to the advocates that come with that? What kind of resistance or welcome did you all receive as you introduced this program?
It's a good question, and it's a process that continues to evolve. There was a lot of resistance initially to that. One of the primary concerns was dealing with more violent crimes. There was a tendency to refer mostly what we would consider minor crimes to the restorative justice program. We're still pushing against that because we think that that all offenses should be considered. Our county attorney was very much in favor of this and was part of the planning committee and was really instrumental in seeing that this was put into place. I think one of the reasons was he saw the heavy caseload that was coming in, and his county attorneys were just having a difficult time managing that. But he's been a very strong supporter. Now, he's the person who deals mostly with misdemeanors. The Commonwealth Attorney has not been nearly as receptive. That office deals with felonies, and so we have not really entered into the world of felony convictions with respect to the restorative justice program. It's a continually evolving process where education in the community is so necessary because we realize that as we publicize more of the successes and and illustrate how this is beneficial to the community and to our young people, we believe that more and more people will be involved with restorative practices. We're trying also in this community to introduce more restorative practices in the school system, so that there can be a better way of resolving discipline problems within the school. And we bump up against walls in that arena as well.
I would just say here, we have some restorative programs that are actually here in St. Louis County. They're actually run by the court. The the issue or the struggle with them is that they are in places that they're not in the school districts that the brown and black kids come from. They're in the white school districts. So um, we do have them here, but all 5 of the pilots are in places that the kids that are most disproportionately affected, they're not in those school districts. Um, and I guess there's lots of reasons for that. But my hope would be is that one of our conversations with the county is, we need to get some of these restorative practices in the places where the kids are disproportionately affected.
Thanks. So we have a question, a 2-part question about in this pipeline, are there critical moments that could be considered exit ramps? Are there any exit ramps, and and if there are, where might a couple of those be? And are most of them initiated by the community members? Are there sort of exit ramps to this pipeline being initiated by elected officials or systemically? So just a question, that those 2 questions together, really.
Yeah. So there's so many models out there about the places where there can be natural, we call them dropouts or breaks in the pipeline. I mean, Dean's mentioning one of them, like school is a good place to, like before that school resource officer makes that referral and brings that kid to juvenile. Like if at the school, there could be some alternatives, because we know that once a kid gets in, it's hard to get them out. It's hard to, once they've come into contact with the system. And so the juvenile justice system would prefer, that the kid doesn't even come into detention, the kid doesn't even make it to detention. So school is a key place that could happen in terms of some alternatives being created around fair and impartial discipline. Once a kid is in the juvenile system, there are alternatives that are being built. Things like drug court, things like, so drug court would be like, well, you go to rehab instead of, receiving this charge, or you complete this program that's community-based versus you being inside the detention center. So these alternative and these dropouts that take kids out of detention and confinement and place them back in the community, which has been shown over and over and over to be that community-based interventions are better than detention, are better than confinement. They're more effective. They reduce recidivism. And so there are communities that are really progressive and have really have begun to create these alternatives to detention. Except for in extreme cases.
I could add 2 things to that, Deetra. One is the fact that when juveniles go through the restorative justice program here in Louisville and they complete it and they complete whatever the remediation might have been, they have no court record. And that is a significant aspect with respect to their future. So they it doesn't seem like that critical a thing for us when we think about a juvenile who may have a criminal court record. But by not having that, it erases that event from the court records, and that helps them in their progress in the future. The second thing that I think is lacking in most of our communities is some type of a mentoring system for juveniles that are leaving detention or leaving the court system. And we work with adults who are leaving prison and provide them a mentoring program, but we don't have a parallel for juveniles. And I really think that our churches could be an incredibly powerful resource for providing mentoring for juveniles who have either entered the criminal justice system or are leaving the criminal justice system.
Yeah, their ministry called Youth for Christ. They are one of the ministries that I know nationally that have focused on juvenile justice work, and they do have the beginnings of mentoring programs.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Deetra, there's a clarifying question for one thing that you talked about. You talked about in Florida the suspensions that come right ahead of standardized tests being taken.
Mm-hmm.
The clarification is that due to the pressure of testing or to remove students perceived to bring scores down? Is that
to
both?
remove the students perceived to bring scores down. This was a 2006 study that was done in Florida. But yeah, the idea is, the kids that are low performing, I want my classroom to do better. And so let's get this, it creates a pressure to get the low performing students out. And unfortunately, there's been evidence to support that, like the Florida study.
Thanks. We probably have time for one more question and then some closing comments. And this is, has there been any follow-up studies related to juveniles that have completed something like a restorative justice program or a mediation program? Are there any studies that show that this makes a difference in the long run? Is that a dropout? What I think your phrase was, is that a dropout place?
Yeah, I didn't have time to talk about one of the great models in Georgia is the Clayton County System of Care. Some folks in the juvenile world might have heard of Judge Teskey in Clayton County, Georgia, and they created a system of care that coordinates kind of all the pieces that we're talking about. So school, police, community providers, the juvenile courts. He's one of the lead juvenile court judges. And so if you just put in, you just Google Clayton County System of Care, it'll come up and you'll be able to actually see the model. There's videos that kind of shows you some of the programs that they use. And this was sponsored by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So the Annie E. Casey Foundation is also a great source if you want to find out like who's doing what, who's on the cutting edge of doing these kind of restorative justice practices around juvenile justice. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has been a funder and has some models out there. And so if you go on their site, you'll find Clayton County, Georgia. You'll find some other states that have been doing some of the innovative work.
Thanks for that. There is some interest in the questions about, I think, Dean, what you talked about related to congregations providing mentoring programs similar to what Mission Behind Bars and Beyond is providing in Kentucky for adult returning citizens. And I think that's a good idea to think about in terms of more research to see if we can find if there's some resources like that, or if that's something we as disciples can come together to create and share out. So thanks for those questions related to that and that very interesting idea about another possible way of moving forward together. We didn't get to all the questions, but we do have them, and we'll work with Dean and Deetra to maybe answer some of these by email, some of the remaining questions, and we really look forward to hearing back from those who participated in this call today with ongoing thoughts that you have or places where this might have sparked your imagination, or together we might be able to create some new responses or to participate in some effective responses that are already happening in other parts of the system. Dean and Deetra, thank you so much for bringing your expertise and your experience to this call, and we're very grateful to Reconciliation Ministries for co-sponsoring this webinar today. Thanks to each of the participants for your time and your interest in this topic, and keep your eyes and ears open as we continue to find ways to bring issues around the school to prison pipeline and incarceration and issues related to solitary confinement to the attention of disciples, and to find ways together to effectively advocate and work for systems of true justice. I hope the rest of your afternoon goes well, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.